The wind off the ridge had teeth, carrying the sharp, metallic taste of a coming storm. Elias Thorne was out mending the north fence, her hands raw from the bite of the wire, and her thoughts buried a decade deep in the silence of the hills. The steady rhythm of the work was the only prayer she still knew. She would twist the pliers, pull the staple, and listen as the wire sang a high, tight note against the wood. She saw them then, three shapes like broken birds crumpling against her gate. Their town dresses were torn and heavy with mud, and their bare feet bled into the dry dust of the trail. One woman's hand stayed splayed against the timber, her fingers curled like claws as she fought to stay upright. They made no sound at all, leaving the wind to do the keening for them. Elias recognized that look immediately, the hollowed-out stare of people who had been discarded by the world. The town had finished with them, and she knew better than anyone that the town had a cruel way of finishing things it no longer wanted. She set down her pliers without a word. The choice was already made before she even reached the gate. She brought them inside one at a time, her arm wrapped firm around a waist or a shoulder tucked under a trembling frame. The stark quiet of the cabin seemed to swallow their ragged breathing as they crossed the threshold. There were no questions asked, only the steady movement of necessary action. She heated water on the cast iron stove until the steam rose in thick clouds. The sharp, clean scent of lye soap soon cut through the heavy smell of road dirt and the lingering tang of fear. She washed them with a rough cloth, performing the ritual with a solemn gravity that made the water in the basin turn gray and then a deep, murky brown. She worked gently around the raw wounds on their feet and legs, noting the damage from stones and thorns rather than any sign of sickness. The curse the town spoke of was nothing more than a lie painted onto healthy skin. The youngest girl, Beth, wept without making a sound, while the tall one named May simply stared at the wall with her jaw clenched tight. The woman who had been leading them at the gate, Cora, watched every move Elias made. Her gaze was a physical weight in the small room. Later that evening, the first goat kidding of the season forced a sudden crisis in the barn. The nanny was in clear distress with her labor stalled, and the straw beneath her had grown dark with fluid. Elias didn't have to ask for help because she simply moved toward the animal, and the women followed her into the shadows. It was messy, desperate work that left their hands slick and their voices low with a sudden, shared urgency. A life depended entirely on their collective effort, so Elias guided the process while Cora held the goat steady and May applied the necessary pressure. Even Beth found a role fetching clean rags, and a silent communication built between them in the flickering lantern light. Then came the wet slither of new life onto the straw, followed by the nanny's ragged bleat and the sight of the kid, wobbling and new. In the quiet hum of relief that followed, Cora finally spoke, her voice sounding raw and unused. She told Elias how they had seen the preacher with the mayor's wife in the livery loft, and how the fever was just a story invented to discredit them. It was a way to make them out to be liars before they ever had the chance to speak the truth. The hypocrisy was laid bare, a secret used as a jagged weapon against the vulnerable. Elias heard the words and felt the old, rusted lock on her own heart begin to groan. A different kind of truth was stirring in the dark of that barn. The rhythm of the days became their new, shared vocabulary, and chores were the only words they truly needed to get by. Feeding the goats took up the early light. Mending the torn hem on May's dress occupied the quiet afternoons. They spent hours walking the land to check the fence line Elias had been fixing when the women first arrived, their boots sinking into the same red dirt. Elias felt her long isolation beginning to fray at the edges. She caught herself listening for the sound of Cora's voice drifting from the garden plot, or noting how May could sharpen a blade better than any ranch hand she'd ever known. The silence of the ridge no longer felt empty, because the presence of these women was filling it up. A week after the kidding, a deputy rode up the trail on a horse that looked as tired as he did. He was young, wearing a hat that stayed too clean for this country, and he didn't bother to dismount. "Miss Thorne," he tipped his hat, acting polite as a snake in the sun. "The town is getting concerned, and we heard you took in some sick folk. For everyone's safety, it'd be best if they came back with me now." Elias stood on her porch and wiped her stained hands on her trousers. She said nothing about the preacher or the mayor's wife, because that secret wasn't hers to trade away just yet. "They're under my roof," she said, her voice flat and hard as a hearthstone. "And they're not sick. The town physician says different." The deputy's smile was thin and didn't reach his eyes. "A fever can be catching in more ways than one, Miss Thorne." The threat hung in the air long after he turned his horse and retreated down the slope. The world she had kept at bay was at her gate now, and it wasn't going away. That night, Cora found Elias sitting alone by the hearth. Elias was staring at a small, carved wooden horse that sat on the mantel, its paint faded and the wood smoothed down by a child's hand. Cora didn't speak to break the stillness. She just sat on the stool nearby, her presence acting as a quiet question that Elias finally felt ready to answer. Elias's voice was unused to the shape of this story, and it rasped out of her like wind through dry corn husks. Her name was Lily, and she was only 2 when the fever took her in 3 days. She picked up the horse, her thumb tracing a worn ear. "My husband Jacob dug the grave right out under the big spruce, but he never said another word to me after that. Not one." The next morning, his side of the bed was empty and his clothes were gone from the hook. She had carried his abandonment as proof of her own failure. It was a life sentence written in his silence, a weight she had dragged behind her for a decade. Cora's hand came to rest on her arm, and while it was a simple touch, it felt like an anchor in a storm. "Some men run from the pain they cause themselves," Cora said, her own voice low with a knowing kind of ache. "They simply can't stand to see that pain reflected in your eyes every morning." The statement landed clean and sharp in the small room. It offered a new shape to the old wound, suggesting the possibility that his leaving was born of his own shame and unbearable grief, rather than a judgment of her. It didn't fix the past, and the grave was still there under the spruce. The bed remained half empty, but the weight of the memory had shifted. For the first time in 10 years, the lock on her heart didn't feel like it was made of cold iron. It felt like old, dry wood ready to splinter and break. They came at dusk 2 days later when the shadows were stretching long across the yard. The preacher and the mayor led the way, flanked by 2 other men whose faces Elias recognized from her rare trips into town. A handful of others, including shopkeepers and a local farmer, hung back at the tree line like witnesses pulled by a morbid curiosity they couldn't hide. The preacher stood at the gate with his Bible held tight to his chest like a shield against the world. "Elias Thorne, you are harboring the afflicted and defying the wisdom of this community. You are inviting God's disfavor onto this land and everyone who lives here." Elias walked out to meet them without any hint of a hurry. She was a product of this ridge, built of sinew and grit, and she didn't flinch. The 3 women emerged from the cabin behind her to stand on the porch, forming a united front that the men hadn't expected to see. "The only sickness here is in the town's heart," Elias said, her voice carrying easily through the still evening air. "You paint lies on innocent women and call it piety because it's easier than facing the truth." The mayor stepped forward, blustering and red-faced. "Their word against upstanding men? You've been alone too long, widow, and it's clearly addled your sense of Roman." Elias looked past him to the watching townsfolk and held the preacher's gaze with a terrifying stillness. She didn't shout the secret she held, but she gripped it like a loaded rifle she was choosing not to fire just yet. "I know what they saw," she said, speaking quiet enough that the men had to strain their ears to hear her. "And you know that I know. Your authority stops at this gate, so take your false righteousness and get off my land." The preacher's face went pale before turning a mottled, angry red. He understood the reserve of her power in that moment, realizing he had expected a fight with fists or guns instead of this quiet, unshakable knowing. The confrontation wasn't one with violence or shouting. It was one with the sheer, solid weight of a woman who had nothing left to lose and a truth that could burn the town down. The men looked at each other, the fire in their eyes flickering out as they realized the ridge wouldn't break. One by one, they turned back toward the shadows of the trees, leaving the 4 women standing together in the fading light. The men stood broken against that wall of silence, and with the whole town watching, they finally muttered their piece and turned away. The heavy gate swung shut, locking out the old world and its demands. Inside the cabin, the very air felt different, growing warmer as the women moved together to prepare the evening meal. The scent of thick stew and browning bread rose from the hearthstones to fill the small room. Someone began a story, and a single laugh rang out, sounding fragile at first before it took hold and became something real. Elias sat and listened to the rising voices. None of this could fix what had happened in the past. But for the first time in years, the present felt full. The curse this town whispered about was nothing more than a lie, because the truest things in this life are built by hands that simply choose to stay.